My name doesn't really matter, but at the time this happened, I was 26 years old and living in Oregon. I worked a normal warehouse job and spent most of my weekends outdoors. I liked camping because it was quiet and cheap, and I had been doing it for years without a single problem. This happened during a short solo trip in early October. Nothing special. I finished a long work week and decided to spend one night at a remote tent site I had used before. It was a designated public campsite, not illegal or hidden, just far enough from the road that most people didn't bother with it. I arrived in the late afternoon. The weather was clear, cold, and calm.
No rain.
No wind. The kind of evening where everything feels still. I parked my car in the gravel lot, grabbed my gear, and walked the short trail to the site. It was empty, just like I expected. I set up my tent the same way I always did. Slow and routine. I cooked dinner on a small stove and sat on a folding chair while it got dark. The forest sounds came in gradually. Crickets. Distant branches snapping. Nothing out of the ordinary. By 9 p.m., I was tired. I cleaned up, put my food in the bear box, and zipped myself into the tent. I turned off my headlamp and lay on my back, staring at the dark ceiling. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. That was when I noticed something small that didn't feel right. There were no animal sounds anymore. No insects. No movement. Just complete silence. It wasn't sudden, but it felt deliberate, like the forest had stopped paying attention. I told myself it was nothing, that sometimes animals just go quiet at night. A few minutes later, I heard a soft sound outside the tent. Not a step, not a branch breaking, just the sound of fabric shifting slightly, like something brushed past the tent wall. I didn't move. I listened. There was another sound, slow breathing, not loud, not close enough to touch the tent, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't mine. I lay there, completely still, telling myself it was just my imagination. I had worked long hours all week. I was tired. I was alone. My brain was filling in gaps. Then I noticed something else. The sound wasn't moving away. It stayed in the same spot, just outside the side of the tent where my head was. Whoever or whatever it wasn't walking through the campsite. It wasn't passing by. It was standing there. And the most unsettling part was this. It felt like it knew exactly where I was inside the tent, even though I hadn't made a sound. The campsite itself was nothing unusual. It was part of a state-managed forest in Oregon, about 40 minutes from the nearest town. The road in was paved at first, then turned into packed dirt. There was a small gravel parking area, a wooden sign with faded rules, and a narrow trail leading to the tent sites. My site sat about 100 yards into the trees. It had a flat dirt clearing, a fire ring made of stones, and an old picnic table that leaned slightly to one side.
No cabins. No RV occups. Just tent camping.
I had stayed there twice before without any issues, which was why I chose it again. I got there around 5:30 in the evening. The sun was already low, casting long shadows between the trees. The air was cold enough that my breath showed when I exhaled. There was no wind, which made the forest feel heavier somehow, like sound didn't travel very far. I was there because I needed a break. Work had been stressful and I didn't want to deal with people for a while. I wasn't looking for adventure or anything extreme. Just a quiet night, a few hours away from noise, and then back home the next morning. I didn't see anyone else when I arrived. No cars in the lot.
No voices. No distant campfires.
That wasn't unusual for this time of year. Most casual campers stop coming once the weather gets cold. I followed my usual routine. Tent first. Sleeping bag laid out. Headlamp hung from the ceiling. Loop. I placed my boots right outside the entrance and lined up my backpack next to them. Everything was done carefully and without rush. As it got darker, I cooked a simple meal and ate alone at the picnic table. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew there was no service. I didn't have a radio or any music playing. I wanted it quiet. Around 8:30 p.m., I walked back to the parking lot to lock my car and double-check that nothing was left inside. The forest looked different at night. The trail felt longer, and the trees seemed closer together. I used my headlamp but kept it pointed down. I didn't notice anything strange then.
No footsteps.
No movement. No signs that anyone else was around. When I got back to the tent, I put my food in the bear box, washed my hands with cold water from a jug, and zipped the tent closed from the inside. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. I pulled my jacket on and settled into my sleeping bag. I remember thinking that it was going to be a quiet night. I was wrong. At first, nothing happened. I lay there listening to the normal sounds of the forest settling down for the night. The zipper of the tent clicked softly as it cooled. Somewhere far away, a branch snapped, and then everything went quiet again. I told myself to relax. I had done this many times before. Being alone in a tent always made small noises feel louder than they really were. That was normal. A few minutes passed. Then I heard something that didn't fit. It sounded like a foot dragging lightly across dirt. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't rushed. Just a slow scrape, followed by a pause. I lifted my head slightly and listened harder. My heart started to beat faster, but I stayed calm. Deer sometimes moved like that, especially near campsites. Then I heard it again. The same dragging sound. This time closer. I held my breath. The sound stopped just outside the tent. I could hear my own breathing inside. The sleeping bag. I waited for an animal noise to follow. Snorting. Rustling. Anything. Nothing came. A few seconds later, the ground shifted. Not enough to be a step. More like someone adjusting their weight. I could tell whatever was out there was upright, not low to the ground. That was when the thought crossed my mind that this might not be an animal. I slowly reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to announce where I was. The tent felt smaller suddenly. The thin fabric offered no real protection. Every sound outside felt too close. I heard a faint exhale, slow and controlled. It came from the side of the tent, near where my head rested. It didn't sound curious or surprised. It sounded patient. I stayed completely still. I tried to convince myself that my ears were playing tricks on me. When you're alone and it's dark, your brain looks for patterns that aren't there. I repeated that in my head. Then the side of the tent shifted inward slightly. Just for a second. Like someone brushed against it with their knee or hand. The fabric touched my sleeping bag and then pulled back. That was when I knew something was wrong. The forest stayed quiet.
No insects.
No animals moving away. It felt like everything around me was listening. I heard slow footsteps move around the tent. They were careful, placed deliberately. Whoever it was wasn't trying to hide, but they weren't making noise by accident either. Each step stopped for a moment, then continued. The footsteps paused directly behind my head. I could see a dark shape through the tent wall as the moonlight dimmed. A shadow blocked the light for a few seconds and then stayed there. It didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the zipper. I just lay there, realizing that something outside the tent was taking its time, and it wasn't leaving. The shadow outside the tent stayed in place longer than felt possible. I counted my breaths too.
Keep myself calm. 1, 2, 3.
I hoped it would move away, that I would hear footsteps fading into the trees. That didn't happen. Instead, the shadow shifted slightly. I could tell whoever it was had leaned closer to the tent. The fabric pressed inward again, this time closer to my face. I could see the outline of a shoulder and part of a head through the thin material. My mouth went dry. I realized I was lying flat, completely exposed, with nothing between me and the person outside except nylon. I slowly reached for my phone, keeping it close to my chest so the screen wouldn't light up the tent. There was no service, but I wanted to be ready. My hands were shaking, and I had to stop myself from dropping it. The breathing outside the tent changed. It became slower, deeper. Not nervous. Not rushed. It sounded calm, like the person had all the time in the world. Then I heard a zipper. Not mine. It was faint at first, just the metal teeth shifting slightly. Whoever was outside was touching the entrance of the tent. I heard the fabric move near my feet. I realized they were testing it, checking where the opening was. That was the moment I truly felt trapped. I couldn't run without unzipping the tent. I couldn't see what was out there. I didn't know if the person was alone. I didn't know what they wanted. All I knew was that they were close enough to reach me in seconds. The zipper moved again. Just an inch. Then stopped. I held my breath so hard my chest hurt. I imagined a hand coming through the opening. I imagined being grabbed before I could react. The footsteps shifted again. I heard them move from the entrance toward the side of the tent. The shadow followed. It felt like whoever it was circling me, deciding where to stand. Then a hand pressed flat against the tent wall, right beside my head. The fingers spread slowly, stretching the fabric tight. I could see the shape clearly. Human fingers. 5 of them. The hand stayed there for several seconds. Long enough for me to understand that this wasn't curiosity. It was control. They knew exactly where I was lying. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I clenched my jaw to keep my teeth from chattering. The hand slid downward, dragging along the fabric, leaving the tent wall shaking slightly. It stopped near the zipper again. I realized then that the person outside wasn't scared of me at all. They were waiting. And whatever they were planning, they were close enough now that I might not be able to stop it. I knew I couldn't stay still any longer. Whatever was outside the tent had already crossed the line from watching to testing. If I waited, I would lose whatever small chance I still had to get away.
My phone was still in my hand.
My car keys were near my boots, just outside the tent flap. The only thing I could think of was noise. Something sudden. Something that might break whatever control the person outside felt they had.
The zipper moved again.
This time it slid a few inches before stopping. Cold air rushed into the tent. I could see a darker shape at the opening, blocking what little light there was. I acted without thinking. I kicked forward as hard as I could, slamming my foot into the tent wall near the zipper. At the same time, I screamed as loud as my lungs would allow. The sound felt strange in the quiet forest, too loud and too sharp. The figure outside stumbled back. I heard a grunt, low and surprised. The pressure on the tent disappeared. I didn't stop. I lunged forward, grabbed my boots and keys, and burst through the tent opening. I didn't look around. I didn't try to see who it was. I ran. I heard footsteps behind me almost immediately. Fast and heavy now. Not careful anymore. I sprinted toward the trail, my boots half on, branches whipping my face and arms. My heart felt like it was going to tear out of my chest. I hit the trail and turned on my car alarm as soon as I was close enough. The sound echoed through the trees, loud and relentless. The footsteps behind me stopped. I reached the parking lot and unlocked my car, fumbling with the door handle. I threw myself inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys onto the floor. Through the windshield, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. A man stepped into the open for just a second. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just stood there, watching the car with his head tilted slightly to one side. Then the alarm kept blaring, and he backed away slowly into the darkness. I stayed in the car with the engine running, lights on, and alarm screaming for several minutes. I didn't chase him. I didn't get out. When I was finally able to breathe again, I drove straight out of the forest without stopping. I didn't feel safe until I reached the highway, surrounded by other cars. That was the first time I allowed myself to accept one clear thought. If I had hesitated even a few more seconds, I might not have made it out. I didn't go back to the campsite that night. I drove until I reached a small town and parked under bright lights at a gas station that stayed open all night. I sat in the car for a long time, replaying everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it. When the sun came up, I called the local sheriff's office. I wasn't sure what to say, but I told them someone had tried to get into my tent at a remote campsite. The deputy I spoke to didn't sound surprised. He asked for the exact location and told me to come in later that morning to make a report. At the station, I explained everything again.
The sounds.
The shadow. The zipper. The man near my car. The deputy listened carefully and took notes. When I finished, he left the room for a few minutes. When he came back, his tone had changed.
He asked me to describe the man. Height.
Build. Clothing. I told him I hadn't seen much.
Just a
silhouette. Average height. Dark jacket. He nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. 2 weeks earlier, a hiker had reported finding personal items near a campsite less than a mile from where I had stayed. A sleeping bag, food wrappers, empty water bottles. At first, they thought someone had abandoned their gear. But when rangers searched the area, they found signs that someone had been living in the forest for a long time. Not camping. Watching. The man had been seen near multiple tent sites, usually late at night. Campers reported noises, movement, and someone circling their tents. Most people brushed it off as animals and left without reporting it. Then a couple found something worse. Hidden in the trees near their campsite was a shallow pit, covered loosely with branches and dirt. Inside were items taken from other campers. Flashlights, shoes, a phone. None of the owners had ever come forward. The man was never caught. The deputy told me they believed he used the same pattern every time. He waited until campers were asleep. He approached slowly. He stayed quiet. If someone reacted or made noise, he backed off. If they didn't, he got closer. He didn't break into tents right away. He tested them first. The realization hit me all at once. When I heard that breathing outside my tent, it wasn't the first time he had done it. And when the zipper moved, it wasn't curiosity. It was practice. I thought that once I left the sheriff's office, the fear would fade. I told myself the danger was over. I had escaped. I was back in my normal life, surrounded by people and familiar places. That didn't happen. For weeks after, I slept with the lights on. Every small sound in my apartment made me sit up and listen. The hum of the refrigerator. A car passing outside. Footsteps in the hallway. I kept replaying that night in my head, trying to remember details I might have missed. The sheriff's office followed up once. They told me they increased patrols in the area and warned other campers. No one was arrested. No suspect was identified. Eventually, the calls stopped. Life moved on, at least on the surface. A few months later, I went camping again. Not alone. I chose a busy campground full of families and RVs. Even then, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the edges of the site, watching the tree line after dark. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The campground was quiet. Not silent like before, but subdued. I listened carefully. Somewhere nearby, I heard slow footsteps. They passed my tent and kept going. I told myself it was another camper, heading to the bathroom. Still, my body tensed the same way it had that night in the forest. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There were footprints in the dirt near my tent. Not close enough to be alarming on their own. Just close enough to show that someone had walked past during the night. They didn't lead to the bathrooms. They didn't lead to another site. They disappeared at the edge of the trees. I reported it, but nothing came of it.
No cameras. No witnesses.
Just footprints and a feeling I couldn't explain. What bothers me most isn't what I saw. It's what I didn't. I never saw the man's face. I never heard his voice. I don't know where he went after stepping back into the forest that night. And according to the sheriff, they never found him. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that breathing outside my tent. About how calm it sounded. About how patient. I wonder how many times he stood just outside someone else's shelter, close enough to hear them breathe, deciding whether or not to move the zipper. And the worst part is this. If I hadn't screamed, if I hadn't made noise, if I had stayed still just a little longer, I don't know what would have happened. And I don't know who he's watching now.